The water hit me at 300 kilometers per hour. My left arm snapped. I felt it break before I heard it, a wet crack that traveled up through my shoulder and into my teeth. The control stick tore out of my grip. The canopy, already fractured by shrapnel, exploded inward. Glass became 1,000 tiny knives. Salt water forced itself into my nose, my mouth, my lungs. The taste was blood and gasoline, and the bitter cold of the Pacific in April. The instrument panel buckled. Metal screamed. My forehead struck something hard. Then the world became a roaring black tunnel, and I fell through it into nothing. I woke up 3 days later. The ceiling above me was white, clean, and wrong. Not the rough wooden beams of the barracks, not the canvas of a field tent. White plaster, smooth and alien. The air smelled of antiseptic, boiled cloth, and something sweet that I would later learn was morphine. Pain lived in my left arm, my ribs, my skull. It was not the sharp pain of fresh injury, but the deep, grinding ache of bones trying to knit themselves back together inside casts and splints. I turned my head. The motion made the room tilt and swim. To my right, a row of beds stretched away, each one holding a shape under white sheets. Some of the shapes moved, some did not. A man in a uniform I did not recognize walked between the beds, checking charts. His uniform was dark blue. The insignia on his sleeve had an anchor and stars. American. I tried to sit up. My body refused. Straps held my chest and good arm to the bed frame, not cruelly tight, but firm enough that struggling was pointless. Panic rose in my throat like bile. I opened my mouth to shout, to demand, to do something, anything. What came out was a dry croak that barely qualified as a sound. The man in blue turned. He saw my open eyes and approached. He was older than me, perhaps 30, with a face that might have been kind under different circumstances. He spoke in slow, careful Japanese, each syllable pronounced the way a child might sound out unfamiliar words. "You are safe. You are prisoner. You will not be hurt." I stared at him. The words made no sense. I was supposed to be dead. I was supposed to have struck an American carrier or battleship, my plane and body dissolving in fire and twisted steel, my name added to a list of honored dead. Instead, I was alive, strapped to a bed in an enemy hospital, breathing air I had no right to breathe. The doctor, I learned his role later, gestured to my arm. "Broken," he said. "Also ribs. Also head injury. You were in water. American sailors pulled you out." The memory returned in jagged pieces. The dive. The ship growing larger in my windscreen. The anti-aircraft fire, closer and closer, rattling the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. The moment when my hands, guided by some instinct deeper than training or duty, had pulled the stick to the side. Just a few degrees. Just enough. I had missed. The bomb had fallen into empty ocean. The plane, crippled by shrapnel and the violence of the impact with the water, had broken apart. Somehow, impossibly, I had been thrown clear. Somehow the fuel had not ignited. Somehow I had surfaced, choking and half drowned, long enough for a destroyer crew to fish my broken body out of the debris field. I was the only man from my unit who survived that day. 11 other pilots had flown out with me that morning. 11 had completed their missions. 11 names would be written in careful characters on wooden tablets at the base shrine. 11 families would receive letters and folded flags. I had failed, and in failing, I had lived. The doctor watched my face as understanding settled over me. He said something else in his broken Japanese, something about rest and healing, but I did not hear him. I turned my head away, staring at the white wall, and felt a weight descend on my chest heavier than any strap. That was 50 years ago, November of 1995, Tokyo. The apartment is small, one room with a kitchen corner, a narrow bathroom, and a window that faces an alley where delivery trucks idle and unload in the early mornings. The rain has stopped. The neon outside paints slow, shifting colors across the ceiling. On the table in front of me, the photograph still lies face up. 12 boys in flight uniforms, 12 faces that believed or pretended to believe that their deaths would mean something. I pick up the pen again. My hand shakes worse now than it did when I was 19 and terrified. Age has taken the steadiness that fear could not. I look at the blank page of the notebook, and I understand that I have been avoiding the real beginning of this story for 50 years. The real beginning is not the apartment. It is not even the hospital bed. It is the moment in the cockpit when I chose to live instead of die, and everything that choice has cost me since. I was born in 1926 in a fishing village on Kyushu where the sea was the only constant and everything else, the weather, the fish, the men who went out and sometimes did not come back, was subject to its moods. My father worked a small wooden boat. My mother died when I was 8. My sister, 4 years younger, learned early how to stretch rice and never complain. We were poor in the way that made poverty invisible because everyone around us was the same. The war came slowly at first, then all at once. Posters on walls, speeches on the radio, teachers with rigid backs and voices full of certainty. By the time I turned 15, the war was no longer something happening in distant places with unpronounceable names. It was the empty chair at the neighbor's table. It was the ration cards. It was the photographs on the shrines, young men frozen in formal poses, their futures already spent. I volunteered for the Navy in 1943. I want to say I did it out of belief, out of devotion to the Emperor and the Empire. The truth is simpler and more shameful. I did it because every boy my age was doing it, because the teacher's eyes burned with approval when I announced my decision, because my father placed his rough, scarred hand on my shoulder and squeezed once without speaking, and I understood that this was what sons did. You went. You served. If you came back, good. If you did not, that was also part of the tide. Training at Tsuchiura stripped us down and rebuilt us. They cut our hair. They shouted us into formations. They taught us to see aircraft silhouettes in the dark and to recite the imperial rescript until the words lost meaning and became rhythm. The first time I flew, strapped into the rear seat of a training biplane with an instructor shouting over the engine roar, I felt something I had never felt on my father's boat or in the schoolroom: freedom. The sky did not care about empires or emperors. It only cared about lift and drag, and whether your hands were steady on the controls. I loved flying. I have never admitted that to anyone, not to the instructors who praised my progress, not to the other cadets who sat with me in the barracks at night, whispering about home and girls and whether death would hurt. Loving it felt like a betrayal. We were not supposed to love it. We were supposed to see it as duty. But I did love it, and that love was the first crack in the wall they were building inside me. By late 1944, the tone in the briefings had changed. Fewer victories, more defensive operations, maps with red arrows pointing closer and closer to the home islands. The word kamikaze appeared first as rumor, then as policy. Special attack units, pilots who would turn their planes into manned missiles, crashing into American ships to compensate for the fact that we no longer had enough ships or planes or time to fight any other way. The day they asked for volunteers, I was sitting in a lecture hall that smelled of sweat and fear hidden under discipline. An officer with tired eyes and a voice like stone asked who would step forward for special attack duty. He phrased it as a question, but we all understood it was not. True sons of Japan would rise. To remain seated was to mark yourself as something other, something suspect. Around me, boys stood, some with tears already streaking their faces, some with jaws locked so tight I could see the muscles jumping under the skin. I stood because my legs moved before my mind could stop them. I stood because the weight of every eye in that room was already pressing down on me. I stood because I was 19 years old, and I had been trained since childhood to obey the shape of expectations. They transferred us to a base on Kyushu devoted to special attack operations. Cherry trees lined the runway. In April, they bloomed, scattering pale petals across the tarmac like confetti at a funeral. The barracks were old, their floors polished smooth by generations of boots. We slept in rows, 50 men to a room, and at night, the sound of breathing and suppressed weeping became a kind of shared music. We were told to write letters, many letters, to parents, siblings, teachers, anyone who might remember us. They gave us good paper and proper brushes. The letters would be delivered after our deaths, proof that we had gone willingly and nobly. I sat at a low table with ink staining my fingers and tried to find words that were not lies. I wrote to my father. I thanked him for the lessons about tides and patience. I wrote to my sister. I told her to marry someone kind, to have children, to live long. I did not write what I wanted to write, which was that I was terrified, that I did not want to die, that the idea of my body burning and breaking against the side of a ship made me want to vomit. We also wrote death poems. short verses in the classical style, comparing our lives to cherry blossoms or morning dew. I tried. I wrote about waves and the sea, because that was the only imagery I knew that felt true. A wave rises high, I wrote, then falls back into the sea. The sea does not mourn. Only the wave knows it was separate. No one understood what I meant. I am not sure I did either. The order came on a gray morning in late April. 12 names read aloud in the mess hall after a breakfast of thin rice and miso soup. I was 7th on the list. The number lodged in my mind. 7th. Not first, not last, but lost in the middle where no one pays attention. We were to fly south toward Okinawa at dawn the following day. We were to locate the American fleet. We were to dive. We were not to return. That afternoon, they lined us up for photographs. One by one, we stood in front of our assigned aircraft, the bombs already mounted under the fuselages like obscene growths. The photographer worked quickly, his camera clicking with the efficient indifference of a clerk stamping forms. I stood stiff, trying to look brave. I wonder now if the camera caught the lie. The night before the mission, no one slept. Some men prayed, some stared at the ceiling. One boy, I never learned his name, sobbed quietly into his pillow until an older cadet hissed at him to stop. I lay on my back, hands folded on my chest, listening to my own heartbeat and trying to imagine what it would feel like to stop. I could not picture it. My mind refused to cross that line. Dawn came too fast and too slow. We dressed in silence. We ate without tasting. Outside, the runway stretched away under a sky the color of old iron. 12 planes waited in a neat row, their propellers still, their fuel tanks full, their bombs armed. Ground crew moved among them with the tired efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again. I walked to my plane. Each step felt wrong, too heavy, too light, both at once. A mechanic handed me a parachute harness. I took it even though we both knew I would never use it. Procedure is a strange comfort when nothing else makes sense. The cockpit smelled of oil and cold metal and the sweat of the pilots who had sat there before me. I strapped in. The harness bit into my shoulders. The instruments glowed as I powered them on, needles trembling into position. The engine coughed, caught, roared. The propeller blurred into a disc. The vibrations traveled up through the seat, through my spine, into my skull. One by one we rolled. When my turn came, I pushed the throttle forward and felt the plane surge, the weight of the bomb dragging at the belly, fighting the lift. Then the wheels left the ground and we were airborne, climbing into a sky that stretched empty and indifferent in all directions. The flight to the target area took just over an hour, 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds. I counted some of them. I stopped when the numbers became unbearable. Below us, the ocean spread out in dull gray waves. Above us, thin clouds drifted. Around me, 11 other planes held formation, 11 other boys in cockpits, each one alone with his thoughts. I thought about my father. I thought about the way his hands looked when he mended nets, the careful loops and knots, the patience required to fix something torn. I thought about my sister's laugh, high and bright, the way it used to cut through the sound of wind and waves. I thought about the first time I ate an orange, the shocking sweetness of it, a taste I would never experience again. I also thought about the men on the ships ahead, American sailors, enemy. I had been taught to hate them, or at least to see them as obstacles to be destroyed. But in that cockpit, with the engine droning and my own death approaching, I could not hold on to the hate. They were just men, younger sons and older brothers and boys from fishing villages not so different from mine. They had been told their own version of duty and necessity. They were standing on decks, loading guns, scanning the sky for specks that would become their deaths. One of those specks was me. The fleet appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, then as shapes, then as a sprawling city of steel floating on the water. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers weaving between them, white wakes curling behind their sterns. Smoke rose from several ships, black columns against the gray sky. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed in the air, dark puffs that expanded and faded, marking where shells had burst. The formation leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Remember your duty." Then his plane tipped into a dive, and the rest of us followed, the neat line breaking apart as each pilot chose his target, each life narrowing toward a single point. I selected a carrier, long deck, island superstructure, planes tied down in neat rows. It grew in my windscreen, details emerging, gun mounts, walkways, tiny figures running. The anti-aircraft fire intensified. Shells burst close enough that I felt the pressure waves shove at my plane. A piece of shrapnel punched through the canopy and buried itself in the seat inches from my head. Another struck my left wing, tearing a ragged hole in the fabric. I began my dive. The nose dropped. Speed built. The engine screamed. The deck of the carrier filled my entire view, a rectangle of gray steel rushing up at me with the inevitability of gravity. This was the moment, the final seconds, the point where a true warrior would close his eyes, shout the Emperor's name, and commit himself utterly to the impact. I opened my mouth. I tried to shout. What came out was not the Emperor's name. It was a single word, torn from somewhere deep and unthinking. Mother. My mother had been dead for 11 years. I barely remembered her face, but in that instant, with the ship filling my vision and the air tearing at the plane, she was the only thing that felt real. Not the Empire, not the slogans, not the ceremonies, just the ghost of a woman who had held me when I was small and told me, in the last days before the fever took her, to live a long life. I could not do both. I could not honor her and complete my mission. One of them had to be betrayed. My hands moved, not a dramatic pull, not a desperate yank, just a small, firm pressure to the side. The stick shifted. The nose of the plane drifted off target. The center of the deck slid out of alignment, moving toward the edge of my windscreen. The ship's gray flank blurred past. The bomb, still attached, still armed, passed over steel and men, and found only water beyond. I hit the ocean at an angle steep enough to kill me, but shallow enough that I did not. The impact was a wall of sound and violence. Metal crumpled, the canopy shattered, my left arm broke at the point where it braced against the frame. My head struck the panel, my ribs compressed, cracked. Salt water flooded in, filling the cockpit in seconds. The world became a chaos of bubbles and darkness and pain. I should have drowned. The harness should have held me in the sinking wreckage. The fuel should have ignited. 1,000 things should have killed me in those seconds. Instead, the frame buckled in a way that threw me clear. I surfaced, choking, half-conscious, my broken arm useless, my lungs burning. I saw sky. I saw smoke. I saw the hull of an American destroyer turning toward me, and I understood with a terrible clarity that I had survived the one thing I was supposed to die doing. Hands pulled me from the water, American hands. Voices shouted in a language I did not understand. I was lifted onto a deck that smelled of fuel and gunpowder. Someone pressed a cloth to the wound on my head. Someone else cut away my flight suit. I tried to speak. I tried to tell them that I had failed, that I was supposed to be dead, that I had betrayed everything. The words would not form. Darkness took me again, and this time I welcomed it. 3 days in the White Room. 3 days of waking and sleeping and pain and the morphine that dulled it into something distant and dreamlike. On the 4th day, the American doctor with the kind eyes and broken Japanese told me that I was a prisoner of war, that I would be moved to a larger facility, that I would eventually be sent to a camp where other Japanese soldiers and pilots were held. He did not tell me that I was the only kamikaze pilot in American custody who had survived a mission. He did not need to. I already knew. 50 years later, in a one-room apartment in Tokyo, I sit with a pen in my shaking hand and a blank notebook in front of me. Outside, the city hums with life, traffic, voices, the distant clatter of a train. The world has moved on. Japan has moved on. The empire I was supposed to die for no longer exists except in history books and the memories of old men. I survived. I came home in 1947, one of the last prisoners released. I told no one what I had done. I told them my plane had been shot down before I reached the target. I let them assume I had tried and failed honorably. I took a job in a factory. I lived quietly. I never married. I never had children. I carried the weight of my choice alone because I did not believe anyone else could understand it. My 11 comrades died that day. Their names are carved in stone at Yasukuni Shrine. School children learn about them in history classes as examples of devotion and sacrifice. I lived, and my name appears nowhere except on pension forms and medical records. For 50 years, I have asked myself the same question. Was I a coward who betrayed his duty, or was I a human being who chose life over death when the empire demanded otherwise? I do not have an answer. I only have the years. Decades of mornings waking up alive. Decades of wondering if my father would have been prouder of a dead son than a living one. Decades of carrying the faces of my 11 comrades, frozen at 19, while I grew old. I click the pen. I press it to the first line. I begin to write in English the story I have never told, not to absolve myself, not to justify the choice, but because my grandson, who has a son of his own now, asked me last month what I did in the war, and I realized that I owe him, and perhaps myself, the truth. I failed my mission, I missed my target, I survived, and I have spent every day since trying to decide whether that was the greatest mistake of my life or the only honest thing I ever did. The pen moves, the words come, and in the cold electric light of a Tokyo apartment in 1995, an old man finally stops running from the boy he was 50 years ago. The first thing I learned about being a prisoner was that shame has a smell. It is sweat mixed with coral dust, and the particular sourness that comes from men who have stopped washing themselves with care. It is the smell of bodies that have given up on dignity because dignity requires an audience that believes you deserve it. The American camp at Guam, where I arrived in June of 1945, smelled like that. Like 3,000 men who had stopped being soldiers and had not yet learned how to be anything else. The truck that brought me from the hospital ship stopped at the gate. A guard with sunburned arms and a rifle slung over his shoulder gestured for me to climb down. My left arm, still splinted and strapped across my chest, made the movement awkward. I landed badly, my feet hitting the coral gravel too hard, sending a spike of pain up through my healing ribs. The guard said something in English, his tone not unkind but utterly indifferent, and pointed toward a row of tents in the distance. I walked. Each step raised small puffs of white dust that settled on my boots, my trousers, my skin. The sun pressed down like a hand. Around me, men moved in slow clusters, some carrying tools, some sitting in patches of shade, some simply standing and staring at nothing. Their uniforms, what remained of them, were faded to the color of old bone. Their faces had the look of men who had run out of things to say to each other. The tent I was assigned to sat near the eastern perimeter, close enough to the barbed wire that I could see through it to the ocean beyond. Inside, 12 men occupied canvas cots arranged in 2 neat rows. The air was thick, barely stirred by the flaps tied open at both ends. When I entered, every face turned toward me. The silence was immediate and total. I stood in the entrance holding my small bundle of possessions, a spare shirt, a toothbrush, a folded copy of my medical discharge papers, and waited. No one spoke. No one moved. They were measuring me, not with hostility, but with the cold calculus of men who had learned that new arrivals could be threats, allies, or simply more weight in an already overcrowded boat. Finally, an older man with a shaved head and a scar cutting across his left eyebrow broke the silence. His voice was rough, worn smooth by years of shouting orders, or perhaps just by exhaustion. What unit? The question was simple. The answer was not. I had spent 3 months in the hospital preparing for this moment, building a version of the truth that I could say aloud without choking on it. My plane was shot down before I reached the target. I was pulled from the water. Both sentences were factually accurate. What they did not say was that I had pulled the plane off course, that I had chosen the water, that I was the only man in my unit who had not completed his mission because I had not wanted to die. Naval Air Corps, I said. Special Attack Unit, shot down over Okinawa. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something I could not read. Then he nodded toward an empty cot in the far corner. That one is yours. The last man who slept there died 2 weeks ago. Dysentery. Do not drink the water unless it has been boiled. I crossed the tent and set my bundle on the cot. The canvas was stained and smelled of mildew. I sat carefully, favoring my ribs. Around me, the other men returned to what they had been doing. One stitched a torn shirt with thread so fine it was almost invisible. Another lay on his back, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been madness. A third scratched characters onto a scrap of paper with a pencil worn down to a nub. No one asked me anything else. In a prisoner camp, silence is a kind of mercy. The days blurred into routine. Wake before dawn when a guard walked between the tents banging a metal rod against a pot. Stand for roll call while Americans with clipboards mispronounced our names and checked us off lists. Eat breakfast, thin rice porridge that tasted of nothing. Sometimes a piece of overripe fruit. work details, digging drainage ditches that filled with rain, clearing brush that grew back within weeks, moving stones from one pile to another for reasons no one explained. Lunch, more rice, occasionally a strip of dried fish, more work, dinner, evening roll call, lights out. The work was not cruel, but it was empty. We were not building anything. We were not repairing anything. We were simply being kept busy, our bodies used up in labor that produced nothing but fatigue. It was a different kind of violence, slower and more corrosive than a bullet. In the evenings, the men gathered in small groups. Some played cards with decks so worn the suits were illegible. Some told stories about home, embellishing the details each time they were repeated until the stories became more real than the memories they were based on. Some sat in silence, staring at the tent walls or the distant ocean, their minds somewhere the camp could not reach. I did not join them. I sat on my cot, back against the pole, and listened. Every man in that tent carried the same wound: capture, survival, the knowledge that to their families, their nation, their emperor, they were worse than dead. A dead soldier could be honored. A captured soldier was a source of shame. One night, perhaps 3 weeks after I arrived, the older man with the scar sat down beside me without asking. His name, I had learned by listening, was Yamada. He had been a sergeant in an infantry regiment captured on Saipan after his unit was overrun. He moved slowly, his body stiff from old injuries and the constant labor. "You do not talk," he said. It was not a question. There is nothing to say. Everyone here has something to say. The difference is whether they have the courage to say it. I looked at him. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and service. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "What do you want to know?" I asked. He shrugged. "I want to know why a special attack pilot is sitting here instead of being honored at Yasukuni Shrine." The words landed like a punch. My breath caught. My chest tightened. I could feel my pulse in my temples. For a moment, I considered lying, repeating the story about being shot down by enemy fire. But Yamada's eyes held no judgment, only a tired, patient curiosity. The curiosity of a man who had seen enough to know that the truth was always more complicated than the stories. "I missed my target," I said. "My plane was damaged. I hit the water instead of the ship." Yamada nodded slowly. "Many men here missed their targets. The Americans do not care. We are all the same to them. But we know. We carry it. The question is whether we can live with it." He did not wait for a response. He stood, his knees cracking audibly, and walked back to his cot. The conversation, brief and almost casual, opened something inside me that I had kept sealed. Over the following weeks, I began to speak more. Not about the dive, not about the choice, but about smaller things. The fishing village, my father's hands, scarred and strong from decades of mending nets. The taste of salt in the winter air. The men listened, and in listening, they gave me permission to exist. But the nights were different. At night, when the camp was dark, and the only sounds were breathing and the distant crash of waves, the truth returned. I lay on my cot and replayed the dive in obsessive detail. The ship growing larger, the anti-aircraft bursts. The moment my hands moved 2 centimeters to the left, the sailor with his mouth open. The water. I counted my dead. 12 planes had taken off that morning. 11 had completed their missions. 11 pilots had turned themselves into fire and shrapnel and brief, bright blooms of destruction against American steel. 11 families had received folded flags and letters written in formal script. 11 names had been carved into stone. 1 pilot had pulled his plane off course at the last second and survived. 1 pilot had chosen himself over the empire. 1 pilot was now a number on a clipboard in a prisoner camp, eating rice porridge and digging ditches that served no purpose. I did not know which was the greater betrayal, dying for a war that was already lost, or living despite the expectation that I would die. In August, the world changed. It began with a shift in the guards. They became quieter, more tense. They gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices. The prisoners noticed. We had nothing but time to notice. Rumors spread like disease. Something was happening. Something large. On the morning of August 15th, the camp commander assembled all 3,000 prisoners in the open space between the tents. We stood in rough formations, the sun already brutal, sweat running down our backs. The commander, a colonel with gray hair and a face carved from wood, stood on a platform. Beside him, a Nisei interpreter in an American uniform waited, his expression carefully neutral. The colonel spoke. The interpreter translated, his Japanese formal and precise. The emperor has announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war is over. You will remain here until repatriation can be arranged. You are no longer combatants. You are civilians waiting to return home. The silence that followed was not relief. It was the sound of 3,000 men trying to understand what they had just heard. The empire, eternal and divine, had surrendered. The war, which had consumed years of our lives, was over. We had not won. We had lost. Around me, men began to collapse, not fainting, but sinking to their knees, their bodies folding as if the news had broken something structural inside them. Some wept. Some shouted, short, animal sounds of rage or grief. Yamada, standing a few meters away, simply closed his eyes and stood very still, his jaw working as if chewing something too hard to swallow. I felt nothing at first. Numbness. A blank space where emotion should have been. Then slowly, a cold weight settled into my chest. The war was over. The mission I had failed no longer mattered. The 11 men who had died that day in April had died for a cause that had just been declared lost. Their sacrifice, which was supposed to echo through eternity, had lasted 4 months. I had survived for nothing, or I had survived for everything. The line between the two was so thin I could not see it. In the days after the announcement, the camp changed. Work details became optional, food improved slightly, a little more rice, occasional vegetables. The guards relaxed, their rifles no longer quite so ready. But among the prisoners, a different kind of tension grew. We were going home, but to what? Japan had been burned, cities reduced to ash, families scattered or dead. The structure that had defined us, emperor, duty, honor, had collapsed. We were men without a framework, soldiers without a war, sons of an empire that no longer existed. Repatriation began in October. They sorted us by region and loaded us onto transport ships in waves. I was in the 4th group, scheduled to depart mid-November. The night before we boarded, I could not sleep. I sat outside the tent looking at the ocean and tried to imagine what I would say to my father. I am alive. I failed. I am sorry. Forgive me. The words felt hollow. Worse than hollow. They felt like lies because I was not sorry for surviving. I was only sorry that surviving required me to live with what I had done. Yamada found me there, sitting in the dark. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I do not know what I am going back to. None of us do. But we go anyway. What else is there?" He sat beside me for a while, saying nothing. Then he stood, placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, and walked back to the tent. I stayed until the stars began to fade. The ship that took us home was a converted cargo vessel, its holds packed with men sitting shoulder to shoulder on metal floors. The voyage took 2 weeks. We ate once a day. We slept in shifts. The air below deck was thick and foul. No one complained. We were going home. That was enough. Or it had to be. We landed at Yokohama in late November. The city I remembered from training, bustling and alive, was gone. In its place was a graveyard, entire blocks reduced to rubble, buildings standing as charred skeletons, people moving through the ruins with faces blank and hollow, their clothes patched and ragged, their bodies thin. Japan had not just lost the war, it had been destroyed. From Yokohama, I traveled south by train, by truck, by foot. The journey took 6 days. Every town I passed through looked the same, burned, broken, empty. At night, I slept in the ruins of stations or in fields, wrapped in a thin blanket I had been issued at the port. By the time I reached Kyushu, I had stopped trying to imagine what my village would look like. I simply walked. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was the color of old iron. The village was smaller than I remembered, shabbier, beaten down by years of rationing and loss. But it was still there, still clinging to the edge of the sea. I walked through streets I had known as a child. Every house seemed to lean more than it used to. Every face I passed was older, thinner, marked by grief. No one recognized me, or if they did not acknowledge it. I was a ghost returning to a place that had already mourned him. My father's house stood near the water, the same weathered wood, the same patched roof. I stopped at the gate. My hand rose to knock. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The door opened. My father stood there. He had aged a decade in the 3 years I had been gone. His hair was white. His face was carved with deep lines. His shoulders, once broad and strong, had begun to curve inward. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. I entered. The house smelled of wood smoke and salt. My sister was kneeling by the fire, stirring a pot. She turned, saw me, and froze. Her face went white. Then she was across the room, her arms around me, her body shaking, her voice breaking. "We thought you were dead. We thought we lost you at Okinawa." I held her with my good arm. Over her shoulder, I saw my father standing in the doorway, watching. His face was still unreadable, but his hands, rough and scarred, were clenched at his sides. "You are home," he said finally. His voice was flat. "That is what matters." But I heard the question underneath. "Why are you home? Why are you alive when so many are not?" I could not answer. Not then. Not for 50 years. That night, I lay on the floor in the small room that had been mine as a child. The walls were the same. The ceiling was the same. Through the thin wood, I could hear the sea, the same rhythm it had always had, indifferent to empires and wars and the choices of boys. I closed my eyes. I tried to sleep. Instead, I saw the deck of the carrier. I saw the sailor's face, young and terrified. I saw my hands move. I saw the water rising. I opened my eyes. The room was dark. My father's breathing came from the next room, slow and steady. Outside, the waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. I was home. I was alive. And I had no idea what either of those things meant anymore. The first time I lied to my father, I did it in daylight. We sat at the low table in the main room, bowls of thin miso soup between us. A single fish, small and overcooked, lay on a shared plate, its eye cloudy and accusing. My sister moved quietly between us, refilling tea, avoiding both our gazes. Outside, the sea was calm. Inside, the air was tight, stretched thin between what had happened and what we refused to name. My father put his chopsticks down. The sound of wood on wood was louder than it should have been. "Tell me about Okinawa," he said. He spoke without looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the wall, where a small shrine held my mother's photograph and a fading print of the emperor. His voice was steady, almost casual, the way one might ask about the weather. But his hand on his knee was clenched, the knuckles white. My mouth went dry. The fish on the plate between us seemed to swell, its smell turning from faint to unbearable. I swallowed. "We took off at dawn," I said. 12 planes. We were briefed the night before." I heard myself and hated the softness in my voice. It sounded like a boy's voice, not a man's, not a pilot's, not a son who had gone to war and returned. My father nodded once, still staring at the wall. "And then?" he asked. The truth rose like bile. I pulled away. I chose the water. I chose myself. I gripped my chopsticks so hard my fingers hurt. "We were hit by anti-aircraft fire," I said. I forced the words out, shaping them carefully. "The plane was damaged. I lost control." My sister's hand slipped. The teapot clinked against the cup, spilling a thin line of tea onto the table. She flinched, murmured an apology, and wiped it quickly with her sleeve. She did not look at me. My father turned his head slowly and looked at me for the first time since the question. His eyes were not angry. Anger would have been easier. They were searching, as if he were looking through my face for something he had misplaced there years ago and was no longer sure existed. "You lost control," he repeated. "Yes. You were the only one to lose control." The room seemed to tilt slightly. The sound of the sea came through the thin walls, steady and indifferent. I heard my own heart, loud in my ears. "Yes," I said again. He held my gaze for a long time. Then he nodded once, a short, decisive movement, and picked up his chopsticks. "Then you were unlucky," he said. "Not unworthy." The word he did not say sat between us like a third presence at the table. Coward. We ate in silence. The fish tasted like ash. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it came in fragments, broken by images that blended memory and imagination until neither could be trusted. The deck of the carrier, the 11 planes diving, the water rushing up, my father's eyes searching, the word unworthy, echoing in a voice that was not his and not mine, but something in between. In the morning, I woke before dawn. The house was still. My father's breathing came from the next room, slow and even, My sister slept beside the hearth, curled under a thin blanket, one hand stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. I stepped around her quietly and slid the door open. The air outside was cold. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the line between sea and sky barely visible. The village was quiet, only a few thin wisps of smoke rising from chimneys. I walked down to the shore. The boats were lined up where they had always been, pulled onto the stones, hulls scarred and weathered. My father's boat stood out, not because it was larger or newer, but because I knew every mark on it. I had grown up on that wood. I had taken my first steps on it. I had watched my father mend its nets by the light of an oil lamp, his hands moving with a patient, practiced certainty. I placed my hand on the side of the boat. The wood was rough beneath my palm, cold with dew. It had waited for me. The village had not. The village had moved on, reshaped by war and hunger and loss. But the boat was still the same. It smelled of salt and fish and tar. It smelled of another life I had abandoned when I put on a uniform. A voice behind me broke the quiet. "You remember how to row?" I turned. My father stood a few paces away, hands at his sides, shoulders squared against the morning chill. He wore the same faded jacket he had worn before the war, the cuffs frayed, one sleeve patched twice. "Yes," I said. He jerked his head toward the water. "Then help me." The sea did not surrender. It still needs work. We pushed the boat together, our shoulders against the wood. The familiar strain burned through muscles that had grown used to different labor, digging ditches, carrying stones, standing at attention. The hull scraped over rock, then slid into the water with a soft, heavy sound. We climbed in. My father took the stern. I took the oars. For a moment, I hesitated. The oars felt wrong in my hands, too simple after the complicated controls of a cockpit. But the rhythm returned quickly, muscle memory waking like a half-forgotten song. Pull, breathe, pull. The shore receded. The village shrank. We rowed in silence. The sea was calm, small ripples slapping gently against the sides of the boat. The sky brightened slowly, the gray thinning into a weak blue. Far out, a dark line marked where deeper waters began. "Here," my father said. I let the oars rest. The boat drifted. My father reached for the net. It was coiled at his feet, rough and heavy, patched in a dozen places. He began to cast it with the same practiced movements I remembered from childhood. The net fanned out over the water, a dark shape against the pale surface. When he finished, he sat back and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You are different," he said. The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. I stared at the water. "The war changes everyone," I said. He grunted. "The war killed your mother," he said. "That changed me. But that is not what I mean." I swallowed. "What do you mean?" He watched the net float, its edges slowly sinking. "When you left," he said, "you were proud. Not of yourself. Of the uniform. Of the emperor. Of the idea that you could throw your life away, and it would mean something." He paused. "When you came back, you walked like a man carrying something heavy, but your hands were empty." The boat rocked gently. A gull cried overhead, sharp and brief. I failed," I said. The word came out small, inadequate. It did not contain the full shape of what I had done and not done. My father shook his head. "No. Men who fail look for excuses. Men who fail blame the wind, the enemy, their commanders, their machines. You do not speak like a man who failed. You speak like a man who chose." The breath left my lungs. The sky seemed to lower, pressing down. The sea, which had moments ago felt open and vast, now felt like a closed circle around the small boat. I remembered the American captain in the tent on Guam, the file on the table, the words he had used. "You chose not to release it. You'll carry it forever." My father turned his head and looked at me full on. There was no anger in his gaze now, no accusation, only a grim, exhausted curiosity, the same look Yamada had given me when he asked why I was not at Yasukuni. "Did you choose?" my father asked. The question hung between us. The answer was simple. Yes. The consequences were not. I looked at his hands, the same hands that had taught me to tie knots, to mend nets, to gut fish, hands that had buried a wife, hands that had sent a son to war. Hands that had opened the door when that son returned. "Yes," I said. The word felt like stepping off a ledge. He did not look away. "Why?" The memory rose sharp and clear. The carrier deck, the sailor's face, the split-second decision that had stretched into 50 years of silence. Because I wanted to live, I said. And because I saw his face. Whose? An American sailor. A boy. My age. Maybe younger. He was looking up at me. He was not screaming. He was not shooting. He was just there. And suddenly it was not a ship, not a target. It was him. One person. And I could not make myself turn him into fire. My voice broke on the last word. I hated the sound of it. I wanted to swallow it back, to replace it with something cleaner, something more in line with slogans and speeches and the glorious death that had been promised to me. My father's jaw tightened. You chose him over your comrades, he said quietly, over the men who died beside you, over your country, over your emperor. He was not wrong. The words were a knife laid gently on my throat, not yet pushed in. I nodded. Yes. The wind picked up slightly, sending small ripples across the water. The net bobbed, its weighted edges sinking deeper. My father looked away, out toward the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. When the war began, he said, I was angry. Angry that I was too old to be called. Angry that my hands were needed for fish instead of rifles. I watched boys march away in uniforms, and I envied them. I thought they were lucky. He smiled without humor. Then the telegram started. One house, then another, then another. The village became a place of black clothes and quiet houses. Envy is a foolish thing. He fell silent. The boat drifted. I waited for him to say the rest, to say that I had dishonored those boys, that I had spat on their graves, that I should have died with them. Instead, he said something else. Your brother, he said, would have died gladly. The words hit me harder than any accusation. I stared at him. I do not have a brother, I said. You were not born yet, he replied. He spoke without turning his head, his eyes still on the horizon. He died before you. He was 12. Fever. The doctor could do nothing. Your mother held him as he burned. I held her. When he died, she did not cry. She stared at me and said, at least he did not die for nothing. I did not understand. Years later, when the war began, I did. He turned to me then. If you had died on that ship, he said, I would have said those same words about you. At least he did not die for nothing. That is what we told ourselves to make the weight bearable. He paused. But now you are here, alive. And I must ask a different question. His eyes held mine with a quiet intensity. Can you make your life worth more than your death would have been? The question stunned me. I had expected judgment, condemnation. I had been carrying it myself since the moment the water closed over my cockpit. I had not expected tasking, a challenge, a burden shaped not like a grave but like a road. I do not know, I said honestly. Then that is your work, he said. Not mine, not the emperor's, not the Americans', yours. The net tugged. My father moved quickly, hands sure and economical as he began to haul it in. The rope burned my palms as I took hold and pulled with him. The weight increased. Silver flashes broke the surface, fish thrashing in the mesh, scales catching the weak morning light. We brought the net into the boat. Fish flopped at our feet, their mouths opening and closing in silent, frantic protest. My father picked one up, its body twisting in his grip, and struck its head against the edge of the boat. The movement was quick, practiced, merciful. He handed me another. Kill it, he said. I hesitated. It stared at me, one round, uncomprehending eye. Not human, not a boy, not a sailor on a deck, just a fish. My fingers tightened. For a moment, the distance between this small life and the life I had refused to take seemed impossibly wide. Then, in a sudden, almost angry movement, I brought the fish down against the wood. It jerked once, twice, then went still. My father nodded once. Life and death, he said, do not care about our speeches. They care about our hands, what they do, what they refuse to do. We worked in silence, killing, sorting, arranging the fish. The boat slowly filled with the clean, sharp smell of blood and salt. By the time we turned back toward shore, the sun was higher, the village clearer. Children ran along the beach. Women stood by the water, buckets in hand. Smoke rose in thicker lines from the houses. As we approached the shallows, figures gathered near where we would land. Word had spread quickly. The war was over. The son who had gone to die had returned. Among the faces, I recognized one man immediately, Tanaka, not my comrade. That Tanaka lay in pieces at the bottom of the Pacific, part of an explosion that had consumed ship and plane and flesh together. This was his father, a short man with a barrel chest and a face carved by years of sun and salt. Older now than I remembered, his back slightly bent, his hair more gray than black. He had been my father's friend since before I was born. Their boats had gone out together countless times. Their families had shared rice when rations ran short. When I left for the Navy, he had clapped me on the back and said, "Bring honor home." Now he stood on the shore, watching the boat approach, his eyes fixed on me. We grounded the hull. I jumped into the shallows, cold water biting at my calves, and helped my father pull the boat onto the stones. People moved forward, hands reaching for baskets, for nets, for fish. Tanaka did not move. He waited until we stood on dry ground. Then he walked up to my father and bowed deeply, his hands at his sides, his back bent with more than age. "Your son has returned," he said. His voice was rougher than I remembered. Each word seemed to scrape his throat. My father bowed in return, slightly less deeply. "He has," he said. Tanaka straightened slowly. Then he turned to me. Up close, the changes were clearer. New lines around his eyes, a slight tremor in his left hand, a hollow where once there had been a kind of gruff humor. "You flew with my boy," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. The villagers had gone quiet. The only sounds were the lap of water against stone and the distant call of gulls. He searched my face. "He died well," Tanaka said. His voice shook, but only slightly. The words were rehearsed, worn smooth by repetition. "He died with honor." The letter said so. I thought of Tanaka's plane diving alongside mine, the brief glimpse I had of his wing in my peripheral vision, the way it held steady, unwavering, as he committed himself fully to impact. "He did," I said. The lie landed in my mouth like a stone. Tanaka's eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "And you." He stopped. His jaw worked. He swallowed. "And you survived." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung there, heavy as lead. My father stood beside me, his shoulders squared. He did not speak. He did not move. The village watched. I could have repeated the story. Damage, loss of control, misfortune, unlucky, not unworthy. Instead, I heard my father's voice in my head. "Can you make your life worth more than your death would have been?" I looked at Tanaka. "Because I chose not to die," I said quietly, "and I chose not to kill one man I could see." The words shocked even me. They were small in volume, but enormous in consequences. For a second, no one moved. Then Tanaka stepped forward. His hand came up sharply. The slap cracked through the air like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. The world flashed white for an instant. Heat bloomed across my cheek. The murmur of the villagers swelled, then cut off abruptly, as if someone had drawn a knife through the sound. Tanaka's hand trembled. "My boy died for all of us," he whispered. His breath smelled of old tea and salt. His eyes shone with unshed tears. "You chose one enemy boy over him. Over me. Over this village." I did not look away. "Yes," I said again. He stared at me as if trying to memorize my face, to carve it into his memory alongside his son's. "May the spirits judge you," he said. He stepped back. No one spoke. No one moved. Then my father did something I did not expect. He stepped between us. He faced Tanaka, his back to me. "Your son is dead," he said. "Mine is alive. Neither changes what the sea demands. We fish. We eat. We bury. We live. That is all." Tanaka's jaw clenched. He bowed once stiffly, not as a friend, but as a man acknowledging another man's existence. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid, his steps uneven. The villagers slowly returned to movement. Hands reached for fish. Voices rose low and cautious. Life, pressed by hunger, moved forward. My father did not turn around. "Take the baskets," he said. I picked up the first basket with numb fingers. As I carried fish toward the house, the sting in my cheek throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Each pulse seemed to say the same thing. "You chose. You chose. You chose." That night, alone in my small room, I touched the fading red mark on my face. The slap had not broken skin. It had not knocked me down. It was nothing compared to the force of an explosion or the pressure of the ocean, but it contained something those had not, a deliberate human judgment. The sailor I had spared did not know I existed. The men in the camp had carried their own burdens and mostly left mine alone. The Americans had interrogated, recorded, and filed me away as information. But here, in the village where I had been a child, my choice had a name, a face, a hand. For the first time, the thought came to me not as a vague, shapeless guilt, but as a clear, sharp line. If I did not die, then I owed something to every man who had. The weight of that thought was suffocating. It pressed down on my chest, made it hard to breathe. Outside, the sea spoke in its endless, indifferent rhythm. Waves rose and fell. Fish swam. Nets tore and were mended. Boats went out and came back, or did not. The war was over. The empire was gone. The emperor's voice, once distant and divine, had come through a radio as thin and human as anyone's. But my war had not ended on Guam, or in Yokohama, or on my father's boat, or on the village shore under Tanaka's hand. It had followed me home. It had changed shape. It was no longer about dying well. It was about finding a way to live at all.